I was asked to talk to you today about effective food safety risk communication with consumers. As I'm sure you're all familiar, that there are big differences between experts and the public in the way they conceptualize risk and the way they respond to risk. And once you factor in potential benefits, it becomes even more complex. As we've just heard from Baruch, that then sometimes we need to really highlight how those trade-offs are being made by people, by communities, and by decision makers. Because at the end of the day, decision makers are making policy. So, as Gulbanu introduced me, I'm very interested in food security. And food security is one of those issues where the definitions have been designed by a committee, so it comes out quite camel-like sometimes. So here's the standard FAO definition, which is normally put up, and also the picture that goes with this. I've just been to 2 meetings where the same FAO picture was used in the context of food security. So it's a situation when all people at all time have physical and economic access to sufficient and safe, nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active, healthy life. Which means that we're thinking about food systems. We're thinking about benefits, risks, costs, and consequences. So if we have to start communicating about all of these things simultaneously, the messages start to become very complex. So we need to start breaking this down, thinking about people's perceptions about all of these issues simultaneously, and then, as I think we've just heard, develop and evaluate communication messages, but also listen and monitor and understand how people and different groups of people across communities respond to those messages. So I'm going to start off thinking about food risks. I don't need to remind you of all the potential and past food scares that have been occurring. The one that I suppose is most discussed at the moment is the issue of GM animals in the food technology area. My personal favourite is the genetically modified goat from Canada, which excretes spider silk in its milk to enable you to make space cables, which is very handy. Apparently it's safe to drink the milk or eat the cheese as well, but I haven't come across any in Waitrose. Various technologies and solutions to food security, insect proteins and FAO recommendation that we start eating insects with very mixed approval in different parts of the world. So if you go to China, it's quite normal to eat a scorpion on a stick. I don't know about Leeds, I guess it's less popular here. The idea of the agricultural innovations, the peri-urban and urban agricultural systems, particularly popular in Southeast Asia, bringing atomic power to the deserts to make them bloom. And these are all issues where risks and benefits are contextualized by the idea of how do we make our food supply more secure. I just want to look at the results of a recent systematic review that we did looking at the food risk communication literature. Prone to the normal caveats that the systematic review process is not perfect. It's all dependent on your selection criteria. We identified 54 papers and found that certain food issues were of greater interest to researchers and indeed research sponsors than others. We found a lot of papers about risk-benefit communication in GM foods, and I think certainly in Europe, because after, shall we call it, the big GM food scares of the late 1990s, sponsoring organisations wanted to do a lot of research in that area, whereas other areas are more neglected. And there is a question about how generic the results and outputs of even that synthesized body of knowledge can be. Quite often, these food issues reflected the occurrence of a crisis or policy concern. 3 broad themes relevant to the development of best practice in risk-benefit communication were identified, and benefit only became an issue really after about the year 2000. And this reflected the characteristics of the target population, the contents of the information, and the characteristics of the information sources. And I would have liked there to be another bullet here, which is about evaluation, or, if we like, community participation in how these risk interventions are developed, but it simply wasn't there. So I can't report that. And perhaps that's one of the gaps in this literature. One of the conclusions from this particular paper was the need to consider the difference between communication under acute or chronic conditions, to undertake the analysis of long-term impacts of communication interventions. And by long-term, I mean over perhaps 10 or 20 years, in the manner of cohort studies that are long established in the area of diet and health, for example. And to perhaps also focus a lot more on how people make trade-offs between perceptions of risk as well as benefit. Most of the literature in this paper focused on risk perception. The issue of acute risks is particularly interesting because you don't know when they're going to happen, or at least I hope most of the time you don't know when they're going to happen. Although rather cynically, somebody said to me at a meeting in Prague a few days ago that if you really want to get food fraud on the agenda, we need a big scare. Has anybody got any ideas? But to deal with an acute risk, recommendations will have to be reactive in terms of the specificity of the messages, apart from a little bit of pilot testing, but the process of communication is where the generic guidelines are going to emerge. An example would be the Fukushima fallout and contamination of Japanese food supplies. Whether or not these were deemed dangerous to health, there had to be a very quick reaction, and this perhaps was unpredictable, other than the fact that it was a nuclear power reactor in an earthquake zone. Chronic risks, more information regarding the impact of the risk and who is affected is available. Here we need to tailor messages according to consumer, citizen perceptions of the risks and benefits, the needs of those most affected, and also understand more about current behaviours and habits so we can build on those. How can we assess changes in behaviour if we don't have those baseline measures? And this was something else that emerged that we hadn't really thought of before, but that there's a difference between instrumental and accidental introduction of food risks. And here we don't mean that somebody deliberately introduced a risk, but it was a consequence of some kind of behaviour or activity that was introduced to make things better, but perhaps had unintended effects. And it's these instrumental risks which are terribly frightening. If we put our minds back to the BSE crisis, a lot of the horror there was as a consequence of a scientific innovation, feeding cattle rendered versions of their close relatives, which was quite horrific. And then the consequence of this in all sorts of terms are enormous. The creations of new governance institutions, EFSA in the UK, the Food Standards Agency, and so on. And then, of course, deliberate contamination and fraud. The horse meat scandal, people in the UK were very, very worried, and also in the Netherlands and some other European countries, not because horse meat in food is particularly dangerous unless it's contaminated by veterinary residues, but but actually because shouldn't the beef chain be the one which is most protected after BSE and all the consequences and fallout of that incident? So if this particular food chain is contaminated by fraudulent activity, then what does that mean for the rest of our regulations and governance within the UK and Europe? It's a huge issue of trust. So again, risk communication, what do you communicate? That there is no risk? Or is it something much more fundamental to the way we govern ourselves, protect ourselves across the broader community? Technology adoption. Again, this has always been, or recently been, a big issue within the food chain, certainly in Europe. If you think about GM animals again, another meta-analysis, I'm actually putting up this slide, not because the results regarding risk and benefit perception are unexpected. I'm hoping Barak might be able to tell me a little bit more about the reason that moral concerns associated with GM animals are higher in North America and Asia compared to Europe, whereas risk perceptions associated with GM animals and food production are much higher in Europe. And that's, again, an aggregate, the results of a systematic review, collating the available evidence up to the year 2012. However, the other point of this particular slide is that, of course, if people have different types of concerns, then risk communication needs to be built around those concerns. So a risk communication in Europe perhaps needs to focus on, well, what are the risks, either to human health, the environment, or in terms of socio-economic impacts associated with GM animals in the food chain? And also, do we need to start communicating about benefit? Here, if people are worried about morality and ethics of genetic manipulation of animals for food consumption, do we start a public debate about this? Do we start instigating public engagement to try and find out what are driving people's concerns, and then pull that into emerging regulatory frameworks? So I guess we know that communication must address consumer concerns with respect to both risks and benefits. This issue of human values also comes in here, and this is not necessarily risk or benefit based. It might even be intuitive or effective, but nonetheless it's there and needs to be thought about. So how do we engage with consumers to identify their concerns? Here's the results of a big project which was running across 9 European countries called Safe Foods, where we were trying to understand people's preferences, priorities and concerns associated with the introduction of personalised nutrition. So we combined quantitative and qualitative research in all of these countries and generated the basis of a survey of around 9,500 people. So we could look at demographic segmentation, national segmentation according to dominant health systems and so forth. And that's just a very quick overview of the type of research that we were doing. Note that we could actually also compare the results with a much smaller cohort of people, about 729 to be precise, who were recruited into a personalised nutrition trial where their DNA and their blood was taken, and they were actually being given feedback about what to eat in line with their genetic profile. What I wanted to demonstrate here was that in terms of people's intention to adopt personal nutrition, as this structured equation model shows, perceptions of benefit were the most important determinant of whether or not they would adopt it. And if you drill down into this using qualitative techniques, it wasn't disease prevention that was the driver, it was the desire in women to lose weight and in men to build muscle. And these were younger people, which was surprising because there's a kind of idea that it's the worried middle-aged well who are the ones most likely to adopt this technology. Another important factor was risk perception. So if people perceived high levels of risk, they were less likely to adopt personalised nutrition, but the risk was about data security. So again, drilling down into this, there was a perception that actually you are sending your DNA off to small companies who are mostly those ones who are driving personalised nutrition, certainly in Europe, and that they would go bankrupt and just sell your DNA on to an insurance company or some other body who would misuse this. Now, in terms of risk communication, it's obviously something that you should focus on in your communication strategy. But personally, I can't guarantee that these small companies won't do that. So it has to be a regulatory issue that stops that happening. So what you can do is communicate that your particular government has put into place legislation to prevent DNA data being sold on, with appropriate guidelines to prevent that happening. But where I'm standing now, developing a message to say that that's absolutely guaranteed is a little bit difficult. But this kind of data would then perhaps go on to inform regulation and governance associated not only with personalised nutrition, but also governance associated with personalised medicine. Is this something which is more generic? Finally, there were some other things that we found that actually benefits weight gain and loss, muscle gain, being slim. Those benefits are relevant to specific individuals. The only people willing to pay a lot for a personalised diet turned out to be those young men, and more affluent ones at that. And it's not a big market at all. And I think it was the combination of convenience, having their personalised nutrition delivered by Amazon, and their aspirations to be on the cover of Vogue or whatever, male Vogue, I don't know if such a thing exists, but which was driving that particular willingness to pay statistic. Okay, my second case example, this is some data that we've just collected in China, looking at perceptions of risk and the authenticity of European products being sold in China. And I think Beth's here somewhere, Beth Clark, who's working on that project with me, among some other people. Other than horse meat, of course, the melamine scandal is a big driver of Chinese consumer perceptions. Children died, many got sick, because milk powder, which was given to children in the form of infant formula, contained melamine, which was put in there for economic reasons to boost profit. Now, it was a terrible story. I think 6 children died, 300,000 got sick. The perpetrator, this being China, was executed, so there was a big penalty. A slight aside, what we have found as part of this project is that however big the however big the penalty, the problem still persists. And that food fraud is one of the biggest global crimes that's currently being, I don't know, crimmed? Is that the word? the criminals are engaging in. So something like 85% of bluefin tuna is not actually bluefin tuna. It's some other kind of tuna. As I've said before, the consequences can be to health. They can be in terms of food safety. Oregano was a case where there were profound food safety implications. or simply being ripped off, so olive oil from Europe being replaced by Chinese olive oil. Economic gain is again at the centre of that. So whilst the vast majority of incidents do not cause a public health threat, it is a source of great public interest. Contaminants may be unknown, and this is the conundrum with food fraud. You have to know what you're looking for. So you can't always spot if something's fraudulent unless you have an idea of the kind of fraud that's being committed. So on one hand, fraud can cause serious health threats. It can also undermine the value of a particular product category or supply chain and devalue a country's domestic and export market. Whisky, I think, accounts for 18% of UK exports, primarily to China and India. Whisky fraud is big. Sometimes alcohol is replaced with industrial alcohol, which is safe but not very nice, or methanol, which is not nice at all. It can make you blind and kill you. So data were collected in 3 different Chinese cities. Infant milk formula, Scotch whisky, and olive oil. In fact, I have to be honest, looking at our data, our Chinese consumers didn't really care about olive oil. This wasn't an issue. The issue was here with the milk powder, unsurprisingly, and Scotch whisky. Again, a quick overview of our research design. We've completed all of the research to about here, and we're working on some industry recommendations, again combining quantitative and qualitative approaches. And this was the model that we got. So the more people are concerned about a particular food hazard, the more they perceive the risks of adulterated food to be very threatening. So, oh, that's it. I'm trying to find a pointer, but never mind. I'll point it out like this. The more positive their attitude towards authenticated food products, and the more likely they are to purchase those food products. Again, the greater the food hazard concern that they have, the greater the perceived benefit of communicating authenticity. Again, the more positive their attitudes and their intention to purchase. And one way of communicating that, again linked to their concerns for various authenticity cues. The thing I wanted to bring out, though, was at the top, there's a bunch of consumers here at the top who really do trust the Chinese government and don't believe that food fraud is an issue at all. So really, for those consumers, trust overrides all of these other perceptions, and they're a very particular group of consumers. These are the kind of communication cues that can be integrated into packaging. So there were things like QR codes and security packaging, which were highly trusted. Hologram stickers not, and I'm not quite sure why that was the case. In the middle was the protected designation of origin, the PDO code, which is used in Europe to indicate where foods originate from. And the Chinese National Organic Product Standard wasn't really an issue at all. I'm not sure if this is because Chinese consumers don't value organic production or because it was Chinese. That's something we'll have to look at. And every meeting I've been to for the last 5 years has said, actually what we need to do is learn how to communicate better using social media. If anyone knows how to do that, could you talk to me afterwards, please? And I'd really love to learn how to do that. I can send out tweets. I was at the British Ecological Society meeting in Cambridge, where I accidentally caused a small Twitter storm by saying that the government takes no notice of public engagement. And I was actually referring to a government a few years ago, but I was quite fascinated to see how the story grew. Not that I really mind, but that wasn't my intent at all. So clearly, big data, how this information is tailored, crafted, passed on, is important. But the impact is something I believe is still very, very difficult to assess and monitor. And this, of course, is also one of those interactive, participatory approaches to communication, which we don't really understand. So my last slide, conclusions. Where we are now, to promote food security across safety, nutrition, waste, we need to learn how to simultaneously communicate about different relevant issues and try and understand how people make trade-offs in decision-making associated with what's becoming an increasingly difficult communication web. We need to take into account the concerns of different individuals. I'm going to throw in here the idea that perhaps people's decision-making is not totally free. One issue is availability and the other is economic constraint. Even though people might want, for example, to eat sustainably, they may not have the economic resource as an individual or a family unit to do that. We mustn't forget cultural determination, that risk communication, people's beliefs and responses are informed by historical context and changes with time. I imagine my data on genetically modified animals and risk perception is already out of date. So can the government give me some more money, please? No. And emerging technologies may be helpful in facilitating communication. Every project I've seen as an evaluator recently has had a little bit of it, which is about app development. I don't know how useful apps are as communication tools and as aids to decision making. At the moment, I feel that there's too much hope placed on the use of these small apps on people's phones, smartphones, as a communication device. Again, it's something I think we need to review, and perhaps in some contexts this would be very useful and in others not. Some people don't have smartphones, for example, the elderly, people who are disadvantaged or who have learning disabilities. So thank you. Questions or comments?